But Syracuse football actually will be playing football in 2.5 weeks. We think all of the ACC teams will still actually be in the ACC in 2.5 weeks, as we are on deadline day to leave the league as soon as next year, and nothing appears to be happening. With that, we bring in our next guest from the Inside Zone. Subscribe to it now. He is Matt Fortuna. Matt, thanks so much for hopping on for a few minutes today.
Hey, thanks for having me. The way you just pumped that up, I felt a little bit like election night, right? Like what's going to happen? Where will all the votes ultimately end up? But right now, all quiet on the Atlantic and coastal front.
Yeah, it feels like election night, but when nobody's done any polling and nobody knows what in the hell's going on. I don't
exactly.
know.
Kind of like real elections, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, watching election coverage and watching realignment coverage the last couple of weeks have a shocking amount of similarities. What do you make, Matt, of basically the last 2 weeks of just like every day? It's like what is going on right now? How can you possibly describe what we just saw the last 2 weeks?
Yeah, Brian, it's been crazy. I mean, look, I think we all cover the sport closely. We all foresaw a day and a time and kind of a power structure like the one we're in right now, right? I mean, all the gravitational forces were pulling toward a couple of mega conferences and probably a conference or two getting left by the wayside. But the manner in which it happened, the way it happened so quickly, I mean, 2 Fridays ago, we're talking about every 5 minutes there's a new headline, there's a new leak, there's a new, Big Ten doesn't want Oregon and Washington anymore. Actually, Oregon and Washington didn't show up to the Pac-12 meeting. Maybe they are going to the Big Ten. And what's that mean for the Big 12? I mean, it was just that day in particular was wild. I mean, it was just very, very unpredictable. And at the end of the day, as things stand right now, and I'm not saying things are done, but, from where they sit right now, we're looking at a landscape that probably does not have a Pac-12 in it anymore. And that's pretty crazy to think about. Again, I saw a day where one, if not two, power conferences would cease to exist. The fact that the Big 12 was able to outmaneuver the Pac-12, and we're looking at a climate essentially without a major football conference on the West Coast is pretty crazy.
And, as recently as, a year ago, that seemed inconceivable, right, Matt? Like the Big 12 2 years ago for sure was on the ropes. The fact that it got to the point that basically the West Coast just got wiped off the map as its own entity is basically unthought about it as recently as 2 years ago.
It really is. I mean, you hindsight's 20/20, but you look back and, there were so many opportunities for this not to happen, right? For the Pac-12 to still exist, whether we're talking about poor commissioners, whether we're talking about poor university presidents who probably were naive in their value of athletics relative to the rest of the country. But again, go back a year from now, Brett Yormark takes over as the commissioner of the Big 12, which looked a little bit like a sinking ship with Texas, Oklahoma on the way out. A year ago today, the Pac-12 is in a much better position than the Big 12. And now we're talking about the Big 12 thriving, at least relatively speaking, and the Pac-12 ceasing to exist as we know it. And there are a lot of people to blame for that, but that just should not have happened. I mean, look, the Big 12's new TV deal does not start for 2 more years. Brett Yormark's decision to essentially skip the line and open the negotiating windows with ESPN and Fox ahead of the Pac-12 to read the market and know that these college rights are not a birthright and you've got to take what's yours and get it as soon as possible and get that security. It was really, really sharp-minded of him. I mean, look at the ACC, for example, right? I mean, ACC schools made over $39 million last year from their media rights package. That's $8 million more than the Big 12 will be making 2 years from now. And yet, if you look at the national narrative, the Big 12's thriving, the ACC is a sinking ship. And look, it's not all harmonious behind the scenes of the ACC. I think or even publicly, I should say, we know that thanks to Florida State. But I think it goes to show you the value and stability, the value of having a group of schools that are like-minded and on the same page with their future direction, because it's working out really well right now for the Big 12 from the narrative department.
Certainly it is, and you're absolutely right. The narrative around the ACC right now is terrible, and yet all the same group of teams will play football again together and all their other sports together this year, which brings us back to the Florida State point. They're saying all of the quiet stuff out loud, and they're yelling it. I mean, they want everyone to know what's what. It's so hard to tell, right, with these contracts and grant of rights and the, in theory, large amounts of money involved to get out of it. How long do you think is realistic before FSU and Clemson, or I don't know who's actually going to be able to jump through that door, actually does, exit stage left from the ACC?
That's my question, right, Brian? I mean, I think, at some point, and right now we're looking at an ACC TV deal with ESPN that runs through 2036. So we're talking about 13 years worth of media rights you'd have to essentially negotiate against. At what point does the math not make sense anymore to stay in the ACC. Now, again, there are a number of different factors that come into play here. It's not just, hey, we want to pay the exit fee to get out of the ACC. We want to sue to get our grant of rights and take them to our next conference. It's, do we have a place to go, right? I mean, the SEC right now, publicly at least, is saying they're good. They're good at 16, and there's still some sense of regionality within that conference. And, this is me saying this is in the SEC, but the SEC expands. Who's to say they don't look at North Carolina and Virginia first and not Florida State and Clemson, right? I mean, they already have Florida and South Carolina. Florida is a founding member of the SEC, and I'm sure will do everything they can to keep Florida State from getting in if it even gets to that point. And look, you can look back and say A&M did the same with Texas, but who are we kidding? Like, A&M was a newer member of the SEC. Texas is Texas, and Texas was also bringing Oklahoma with them. So it was a little bit different of a situation that time around. I just think there's so many moving parts when you talk about the ACC and its future that it's really hard to predict how and when this will unfold, whichever way it ultimately unfolds, right? I mean, Florida State and Clemson may not like this TV deal, but I'm sure Boston College likes it. I'm sure Syracuse likes it, right? I mean, they're making more money in the ACC now than they would anywhere else, and they don't have to travel as much as they would if they were in the Big 12 or another conference. So, the gift and the curse of the ACC you're seeing right now. It's a very diverse conference, and in that case, you've got a lot in the case right now when you're trying to get everyone on the same page. That makes it difficult because you've got a lot of small private schools. You've got some big publics. You've got some schools that look at themselves as national powers in football, and you've got others where football, it's a moneymaker because it's football, but it's not the biggest game on campus, and that's where you're seeing a lot of these conflicts and area of grievances play out publicly.
And Florida State, obviously they're the loudest one, so they're the most obvious one to look at. And, I was talking about yesterday in many ways. Okay, yeah, does FSU want to go to the SEC or get out? Sure, but it's okay. Is Fox going to pay more money or is ESPN going to pay more money? We just saw Apple get snubbed by the Pac-12 and how that all went down. So I guess the question is, like, if you're the SEC, it's not even the SEC. If you're ESPN, you're paying Florida State already. Why would ESPN just pay them more to go play other football games? Like, I wonder what the benefit to ESPN would be for a scenario like that.
No, it's a great question. I mean, it's in the ESPN's best interest to have a thriving ACC. They've got a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of equity tied up in this network, in this conference. So, they don't want to be part of this conference falling apart. I mean, this is not a situation like we just saw 2 weeks ago with the Pac-12, right, where the Big 12 and the Big 10 in particular, which is essentially run by Fox at this point, delivered a death blow to the Pac-12. I mean, they just completely kneecapped them and made this happen. They made Oregon and Washington get into the Big 10. They crippled the Pac-12, and that was that. The running joke afterward in some circles was, I hope I do nothing in life to anger Eric Shanks and the rest of the Fox executives the way the Pac-12 apparently did, because they showed zero mercy, and that's that as far as all she wrote with the Pac-12. But, it's different with the SEC, the ACC, and ESPN, which is deeply tied and invested in both of those conference networks. So the math doesn't seem to make sense in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, SEC Network, ACC Network, that is ESPN. For those that don't know, that is ESPN Properties, and a significant investment on an infrastructure level and the whole thing by the schools and by ESPN in all ways and all those things. As Matt Fortuna of the Inside Zone is our guest here. And it kind of leads us to, okay, there's two next steps, right? There's the immediate next step of, there's schools out there like Cal and Stanford floating around. And then there's the long-term next step of, okay, where is this all eventually going? And say, let's start immediately. Like Cal and Stanford, we talk all we want about football. Like, we're going to watch the Olympics next summer. You're going to be watching Cal and Stanford. Like, that's all the Olympic medals from the U.S. are those two schools. They win so many of them. Like, what's going to be up with these schools? They seem stuck. They have very important athletic departments that don't seemingly have a logical future home at the moment.
Yeah, I think, they're the linchpins as far as what happens next. The dominoes will fall based on what happens with Stanford and Cal. I have a hard time seeing them, Oregon State, Washington State, sticking together and rebuilding up the Pac-12. I have an next to impossible time of seeing Cal and Stanford ever go to the Mountain West, which I think is probably the most likely landing spot for Oregon State and Washington State, although the American Athletic Conference, I think, will try to make themselves a factor in those discussions as well. But when you're talking about Cal and Stanford, and particularly Stanford, we're talking about the number 3 academic school in the country, according to the latest U.S. News and World Report. They've won 26 of the 29 Learfield Directors Cups, which is essentially the best athletic department in the country. And the 3 years they didn't win it, they finished second. They are tied with USC for the most Olympic gold medalists. The school has produced the most Olympic gold medalists. And until recently, they were really, really good at football as well. The idea of Stanford being on the outside looking in is really hard to fathom, and yet they have such a big alumni group. They have so many billions in their endowment that I think worst case scenario, they could go independent. Again, I don't think that's likely. But, yeah, they've got so much power and so many other things working for them that I think they'll be okay. Cal's in a little bit different of a situation just because they're in dead shape financial right now, thanks to a number of terrible decisions. But the fact of the matter is both those two schools are trying to get in the ACC right now. I did not think it made a whole lot of sense for the ACC to add them. It felt very reactive. I think behind the scenes there's been a lot of momentum to pick up, and ultimately these schools have fallen one vote short of gaining admission into the ACC. I don't think any of the 4 schools that are no voters are going to flip anytime soon. That's Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, and NC State. I think there are legitimate travel concerns there, right? I mean, geographically speaking, and I know it doesn't make sense really anywhere anymore, but it just does not make a whole lot of sense for the Atlantic Coast Conference to add 2 schools from the Bay Area other than to essentially pump up their academic numbers. It's not going to do anything for them financially. It's not going to enhance the value of their ESPN contract. It's not going to fix any of the problems that the Florida States and Clemson of the world have with the ACC right now. So I have a hard time seeing that get through. I get, why they might want to do it. I think there's in some corners of the ACC, there's a sense of, well, everyone's getting rated. What happens if we get rated? Or are we going to fall apart the way the Pac-12 did? Well, if we still have 2 more teams, if we have 14 teams, including Cal and Stanford, without Clemson and Florida State, we'll have enough to survive. But even then, I find that to be a hard and tough justification for expanding outside your time zone and really outside your comfort zone.
Yeah. And, I could make an argument that, just add as many teams as you can because when the other people leave, you need somebody left and you might as well do it proactively.
Exactly.
Which is, I guess, the one argument you can make for it. The one thing I've been trying to figure out, and you named it there, the straw poll of who might vote for and who might vote against. All right, if you're going to tell me that Carolina and Clemson and Florida State are going to vote on the side of we're the biggest 3, we'll be fine in the future, I get that. Well, why does NC State think they're part of that group? I have yet to figure out why NC State thinks they're part of the cool club right now.
It's funny, Florida State and Clemson seem obvious, right? It's well, what's this going to do to fix our problems? And it's a fair question if you're standing in their shoes. Carolina has been described to me as, that's a school that when you look at the Olympic sport model, been very, very good to them. And, not only are you inviting extreme competition to that space by inviting Stanford in, you're just making life on your student athletes incredibly difficult, or more difficult, by having them travel across 3 time zones now to see 2 different schools. So I think that's where Carolina falls in place. I haven't been given a solid, firm background reasoning on NC State's stance, other in the sense of NC State and Carolina are usually in these things together, and so they're following their lead or they're talking to one another. I'm a little surprised though that there are only 4 holdouts. I thought there would be more holdouts, although it sounds like this has been ran down their throats by the president, so to speak, and has become much more of a realistic possibility than I think a lot of us gave it credit for when this news first broke a little more than a week ago.
All right, one last realignment question for you, Matt, and maybe actually a football question before I cut you loose here, since the season is right in front of us now. SMU, they keep getting floated around. Obviously, they're bringing in big markets in Texas. They must have a lot of oil money or something kicking around, because it sounds like they've said they go to the ACC and be like, yeah, we don't need any TV money for 7 years. And they're just trying to buy their way back to the big time. I kind of admire what they're doing here. They're like, yeah, just bring us in. We don't need any money, and we'll figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, look, I could probably make more arguments against it than for it if I'm the ACC. Again, going back to the geography aspect, I'm not sure how much weight SMU still carries in the DFW area, but it's not all that different. If you're SMU, it's not all that different than Oregon and Washington joining the Big Ten. Obviously, the dollars themselves are different, but I could not believe once Oregon and Washington got in that number came out, that they were only going to be getting $30 million in TV money their first year, and with a $1 million increase for each of the 7 years of this current Big Ten deal. I mean, they're at the cool kids table. I get it. Like the Pac-12 was a sinking ship. You had to get off it. I get why they did it. It was a good move. But I'm shocked that the Big Ten and Fox were able to essentially convince both these schools to get 50% less money than every other school's going to be getting in that conference. I mean, schools are going to be making probably $60 to $70 million by the end of this next TV deal in the Big Ten. And that's going to be just a little more than 30 if you're Washington, Oregon. And that's real money, within the conference we're talking about. I know Clemson, Florida State likes to talk about the real money that separates them from the SEC right now. We're talking about real money within one's own conference. I mean, you think Bill Knight's going to be okay 6 years from now with making half as much money as Rutgers? It doesn't add up for me.
Yeah, it's a lot of money for Phil to donate every year if he's going to make up that.
Exactly, yeah, there you go. Yeah, he'll make up for it. But.
That's a meaty check to write. All right, man. Actual football before we let you go, with the season coming up, and this is the way it goes. We have our crazy realignment. The season starts and we forget about it for a while because the games are on and it's great. What are you looking forward to this season? If I had to say, all right, Matt, the main thing you want to see as this football season gets going, what piques your interest?
Yeah, I think it's going to be the last season as we know it, right? The last SEC season as we know it, the last Big Ten season as we know it, the last Pac-12 season probably ever, and the last season of the 14 playoff. The prevailing storyline is going to be Georgia, right? I mean, can they become the first team since World War II to three-peat? And you look at that schedule, and outside of that trip to Tennessee, I don't see a whole lot of roadblocks there. Again, I don't think this year's Georgia team will be as talented, as deep as the last two Georgia teams, but they're going to be the runaway favorites in every game. And once you get late in the season and that dynasty talk and that history talk starts creeping in, how are they going to handle that? So I've got my eye on Georgia like everyone else. I've also got my eye on Alabama. I mean, this is the lowest they've been in the preseason poll, I think, since 2011. I mean, their over-under right now is 10.5, which, I'm not offering gambling advice here, but they've only lost two or more regular season games under Nick Saban twice since 2010, I believe, and one of those was last year where both losses came on the last play of the game. So I think Nick Saban, he talks about rat poison. He's got the opposite of that problem right now with Alabama. I mean, everyone's talking about Georgia. Everyone's talking about the dynasty. Let's not forget, the greatest coach, arguably at any level of football right now, is still on the sidelines in Tuscaloosa and very much has a chip on his shoulder and very much has a team that is hungry to prove that they're not done just yet. I could see Alabama absolutely thriving under these circumstances, and I think it's kind of foolish of the rest of the nation to overlook them. Not to take away from Georgia, who's obviously in the spotlight, but the idea of an underdog Alabama is pretty frightening to me.
All right, Matt, great to chat today. Hopefully the next time we talk here when the season gets going, we'll actually be talking more about the football and less about the realignment stuff. But hey, thanks so much for hopping on.
Thank you. Have a good one.
All right, Matt Fortuna. Be sure to subscribe and check him out at the Inside Zone and Matt_Fortuna on the artist formerly known as Twitter. With that, we will take a break. Much more to come after this here today. Phone lines open as well. 315-437-7644. Back after this, QSportsTalk.com, ESPN Radio.